A millionaire mocked a journalist during an interview, unaware that her investigation had uncovered his darkest secrets. Andrew Whitman leaned back in his chair, a picture of self-assured dominance. His office, perched atop a glassy skyscraper that overlooked the heart of the city, was as imposing as the man himself. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling metropolis, their sheer scale amplifying his status as a financial titan. In the center of the room, his desk, a monolithic slab of black marble, reflected the warm glow of the afternoon sun, casting his silhouette in stark relief. Behind him, a curated collection of rare art and sculptures whispered of wealth most could only dream of. "You have 20 minutes, Andrew announced, his voice slicing through the silence with practiced indifference. He didn't glance up from his laptop as he spoke, his fingers lazily scrolling through emails. Across the desk, Clara Hart suppressed the urge to roll her eyes. Her recorder was already running, a small but purposeful device placed neatly on the edge of the desk. It seemed dwarfed by the grandeur of the surroundings, much like Clara herself might appear to those who underestimated her. But she was no stranger to powerful men who believed their money made them untouchable. Andrew Whitman was simply another in a long line of such figures. "I appreciate your time," Clara replied evenly, keeping her expression neutral. There was a faint edge to her tone, though subtle enough to evade notice by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. She sat upright in her chair, a sleek blazer framing her shoulders, and a professional calm in her demeanor that belied the sharpness of her mind. Andrew finally looked up, his eyes, cold and calculating, settling on Clara with a hint of amusement. "Of course," he said, his lips curving into a faint smirk. "Let me guess. This is one of those exposés? A little investigative fluff designed to knock me down a peg? It's cute, really." Clara's fingers tightened briefly around her pen before she forced herself to relax. "This is an opportunity to share your side of the story," she replied. "To address the concerns people have about your business practices." Andrew chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Concerns," he echoed, drawing out the word as though it were a joke. He leaned back further, crossing his legs and lacing his fingers behind his head. "You know, I've been at this game a long time. Journalists like you? You're a dime a dozen, always digging for dirt, thinking you'll find some smoking gun. Let me save you some trouble. There isn't one." Clara didn't flinch, nor did she let his words deter her. She clicked her pen and glanced at the notepad on her lap. "Let's start with Mayfair Development," she said smoothly. "The bidding process for its acquisition has raised questions, accusations," Andrew interrupted, waving a dismissive hand, "from sore losers who couldn't keep up. Mayfair was a strategic acquisition. I don't apologize for being better at this than my competitors. Some might say your success came at the expense of ethical practices," Clara countered, keeping her voice calm but pressing forward. "Reports suggest that smaller firms were systematically pushed out under questionable circumstances." Andrew's smirk faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly. "Business is competitive," he said, shrugging. "If someone can't handle the pressure, they're in the wrong field. I didn't get here by playing nice." Clara made a note, her movements deliberate and methodical. "And what about the families displaced by your projects? Several claim they were misled, left without fair compensation." Andrew leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "I'm not responsible for the sob stories of every disgruntled tenant," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. "This city thrives because of people like me. You think it runs on goodwill and charity? No, it runs on ambition." His words hung in the air, heavy and cold, but Clara didn't miss the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. She scribbled another note, the faint scratch of pen on paper filling the tense silence. Then she looked up, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Your critics might argue that this isn't ambition. It's exploitation." Andrew's smirk returned, more pointed this time. "Critics," he said with a slight laugh. "Everyone loves to criticize success until they're the ones reaping the benefits." Clara leaned back slightly, studying him. She could see the layers of confidence and disdain he wore like armor, but she also saw something deeper, an instinctive need to dominate every conversation, to control every narrative. "I'm here for the truth, Mr. Whitman," Clara said finally, her voice steady. "Whatever shape it takes." Andrew tilted his head, amusement flickering across his face. "The truth is subjective, Ms. Hart. What you see as exploitation, I see as opportunity. That's the way the world works. You can't change it." Clara didn't reply immediately, letting the silence linger just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then she smiled faintly. "You're right. One person can't change the system. But a well-placed story? That can do wonders." The challenge in her tone wasn't lost on Andrew. He studied her for a moment, his amusement giving way to something sharper. "You're ambitious," he said slowly. "I'll give you that. But ambition without leverage is useless. And from where I'm sitting, Ms. Hart, you don't have any." Clara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We'll see." The interview concluded moments later, Andrew dismissing her with a flick of his hand as he returned to his laptop. Clara gathered her things and rose to leave, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. At the door, she paused, glancing back at him. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Whitman," she said, "and good luck." Andrew glanced up, his smirk returning. "Save that for yourself. You might need it." Clara said nothing as she stepped out of the office, the door closing softly behind her. In the elevator, she allowed herself a small exhale. The first move in this game had been made, but the stakes were far higher than Andrew Whitman realized. Inside his office, Andrew leaned back in his chair, his eyes lingering on the door. For the first time in years, he felt a twinge of unease, small and fleeting, but enough to unsettle him. He dismissed it quickly, telling himself it was nothing. But deep down, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that Clara Hart was not like the others. If you were in Clara's shoes, facing someone as powerful as Andrew, what would you do next? Let us know in the comments below. Also, if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Clara Hart sat at her desk in her modest apartment, the glow of her laptop illuminating her focused expression. Stacks of files, newspaper clippings, and a spiral notebook filled with notes were spread around her, creating a chaotic but purposeful mess. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside, punctuated by the occasional honk of a car or muffled voices from the street below. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed the first sentence of her article. Andrew Whitman built his empire on a foundation of exploitation, one that began long before the city knew his name. She paused, rereading the words, her jaw tightening. For years, she had chased stories that revealed the injustices lurking beneath society's surface. But this time, it was personal. Her gaze flickered to an old photograph propped up beside her computer. It showed a younger Clara, no more than 8 years old, sitting on her father's lap. He wore his usual flannel shirt, his warm smile a stark contrast to the distant memories that now haunted her. Behind the image lay a truth Clara had spent years piecing together, a truth that tied Andrew Whitman's rise to her father's fall. It had been over a decade since her father, Richard Hart, had lost everything. A small-time contractor with big dreams, he had once been proud to work on projects that shaped the city. But all of that changed when Whitman Enterprises swept into their neighborhood. Promises of revitalization and prosperity turned to ash as the company's shadowy tactics pushed small business owners out, leaving them penniless and without recourse. Her father had been among the casualties. Overnight, the contracts that had kept their family afloat dried up. Rumors of bribes and backdoor deals circulated, though no one dared to challenge the powerful forces at play. By the time her father realized the extent of the manipulation, it was too late. Their home was repossessed, his business declared bankrupt, and the man who had once been her hero was left broken and defeated. Clara still remembered the hollow look in his eyes the night he sat her down to explain that everything was gone. The vibrant, resilient man she had admired became a ghost of himself. He passed away only a few years later, his health deteriorated by the stress and heartache that followed his downfall. Andrew Whitman, meanwhile, had emerged from the ashes of others' losses as a triumphant force in the business world. His developments reshaped the city's skyline, and his name became synonymous with power and success. Clara had watched from afar as his empire grew, her resentment simmering with every headline that celebrated his achievements. Now, after years of meticulous preparation, She was ready to expose the truth. Clara clicked save on her draft and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with resolve. She wasn't naive. She knew what she was up against. Men like Andrew Whitman didn't fall easily. They wielded influence like a weapon, silencing opposition with lawsuits or smear campaigns. But Clara wasn't afraid of the fight. She had been preparing for it her entire life. A soft knock at the door startled her. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She wasn't expecting visitors. Cautiously, she approached the door and peered through the peephole. The familiar face of Mark, her closest friend and occasional tech wizard, greeted her. Clara unlocked the door and stepped aside, allowing him in. "You're late," she said, crossing her arms. "I thought you were bringing coffee hours ago." Mark held up 2 steaming cups as an offering. "Better late than never, right?" He grinned but quickly sobered when he saw her expression. "What's wrong?" Clara gestured to her desk. "The draft's done. I'm publishing tomorrow." Mark set the cups down and walked over to the files, his sharp eyes scanning the contents. "You're sure about this?" "I have to be," Clara replied, her voice firm. "He's gotten away with too much for too long. It's time someone held him accountable." Mark studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right. Let me double-check the security on your email and database. If Whitman or his team try to come after you digitally, they won't get far." Clara smiled faintly, grateful for his support. "Thanks, Mark. I don't know what I'd do without you." As he worked, Clara returned to her laptop, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. She knew the risks, knew that Andrew would retaliate once the article went live. But she also knew she couldn't back down. This wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about the countless others who had been trampled underfoot in Andrew's relentless pursuit of power. The next morning, Clara's article was published, and the response was immediate. Social media erupted with discussions of Andrew Whitman's alleged corruption. The piece detailed how his company had systematically exploited small businesses, manipulated contracts, and displaced vulnerable communities. Clara had included testimonies from former employees, financial records, and leaked documents to back her claims. Andrew's office released a statement within hours, dismissing the article as a baseless attack by a journalist seeking attention. But the damage was done. The media began digging deeper, and questions about Andrew's empire grew louder. In his corner office, Andrew stared at the headlines with a cold fury. He tossed the tablet onto his desk and leaned back in his chair, his mind churning. Clara's name was now burned into his memory, not as an annoyance, but as a threat. "She wants a fight?" he muttered to himself, his voice low and dangerous. "She'll get one." Andrew called for his assistant, his tone sharp. "Get the legal team on this, and find out everything you can about Clara Hart. Where she's been, who she's talked to. I want it all." "Yes, sir," the assistant replied before hurrying out. As the day wore on, Andrew's frustration grew. He had faced challenges before, but this felt different. Clara's accusations weren't just an inconvenience. They were a direct challenge to the foundation of his power. And for the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of unease. Meanwhile, Clara sat at her desk, watching as the article continued to gain traction. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from readers, colleagues, and even a few whistleblowers who wanted to share their stories. She knew this was only the beginning, but she was ready. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the skyline, 2 figures prepared for the battle ahead. Each determined to emerge victorious, neither fully aware of just how high the stakes would climb. The morning after Clara's article went live, the atmosphere at Whitman Enterprises was tense. Inside the towering skyscraper that housed Andrew Whitman's empire, conversations were muted, and employees exchanged furtive glances. Even the usual hum of activity felt subdued, as though the entire building were holding its breath. Andrew stood in his office, staring at the framed skyline through his window, the tablet in his hand glowing with the article that had thrown his world into disarray. Clara Hart's name stared back at him, bold and unapologetic beneath the damning headline. The empire built on exploitation. The untold story of Whitman Enterprises. Every paragraph felt like a dagger. Detailed accounts from former employees, leaked documents linking his company to shadowy offshore dealings, and damning accusations of displaced families painted a picture he couldn't easily dismiss. For the first time in years, Andrew felt his control slipping. "Mr. Whitman." His assistant's voice broke through his thoughts. Lisa, sharp and efficient, stepped into the office. Her usually calm demeanor was tinged with unease. Andrew turned, his expression stony. "What is it?" Lisa hesitated before speaking. "The board is concerned. Several investors have already reached out, asking for reassurances after this exposé." Andrew's jaw tightened. "And what did you tell them?" "That the allegations are baseless and that you're preparing a public response," Lisa replied. She paused, her eyes flickering to the tablet in his hand. "But they're asking for more than words this time, sir. They want action." Andrew exhaled sharply, tossing the tablet onto his desk. "I'm aware of what they want," he said, his tone clipped. "Schedule a meeting with the board for this afternoon, and make sure the PR team is ready to do their job." Lisa nodded, but didn't leave immediately. "Sir," she said carefully, "there's one more thing." "What now?" Andrew snapped. "Clara Hart," Lisa continued, her voice steady. "She's not just any journalist. Her father—" "I know who she is," Andrew interrupted, his voice cold. "I don't need a history lesson." Lisa bit back a response, sensing the rising tension in the room. "Understood, sir. I'll leave you to prepare." As she left, Andrew sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. Clara Hart. The name gnawed at him. He had dismissed her during the interview, believing she was just another ambitious journalist looking to make a name for herself. But now, it was clear she had been planning this for years. And worse, she had done her homework. Meanwhile, across the city, Clara sat in a dimly lit cafe, her laptop open as she reviewed the flood of emails pouring in. Some were messages of support from readers, others were inquiries from media outlets wanting to amplify her story. But one email in particular caught her attention. The subject line read, "I have information." Clara clicked it open, her pulse quickening as she scanned the contents. The sender claimed to be a former employee of Whitman Enterprises, someone who had worked closely with Andrew during the early years of his career. The email contained cryptic hints about documents that could expose even deeper corruption within the company. The sender had signed off with a single name, Evelyn. "Mark," Clara called, waving her tech-savvy friend over from the counter where he was ordering coffee. Mark slid into the seat across from her, setting down their drinks. "What's up?" Clara turned her laptop toward him. "Look at this." Mark read the email, his brow furrowing. "Do you trust this person?" "I don't know yet," Clara admitted. "But if what they're saying is true, this could be the breakthrough we need." Mark leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "All right, but we need to verify this carefully. If this Evelyn is legit, she could also be a target. Whitman's not the kind of guy to let something like this slide." Clara nodded, her determination solidifying. "I'll arrange a meeting." Discreetly. Later that day, Andrew convened with his board in a sleek conference room. The air was thick with tension as the members, all seasoned executives, voiced their concerns. "This article has legs," one of them said, his voice tight. "It's not just a smear campaign. It's detailed, credible, and gaining traction. If we don't act fast, the damage could be irreversible." Andrew's gaze swept the room, his jaw tightening. "I'm aware of the stakes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Our PR team is already working on a response, and my lawyers are preparing a defamation case against Clara Hart." Another board member, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, leaned forward. "A lawsuit won't be enough, Andrew. The public wants accountability, not just denial." Andrew met her gaze, his expression hard. "The public doesn't dictate how I run my business. This company has survived worse, and it will survive this." But even as he spoke, a seed of doubt took root. Clara's article wasn't just a public relations problem. It was a crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed empire, and cracks had a way of spreading. That evening, Clara sat in a quiet park, waiting for Evelyn. The contact had insisted on meeting in person, citing concerns about surveillance. Clara scanned the area, her nerves tingling with anticipation. Finally, a woman approached, tall, with a sharp, professional appearance, and an air of quiet confidence. "Evelyn?" Clara asked, standing. The woman nodded. "Clara Hart. It's good to meet you." They sat on a bench beneath a canopy of trees, the city's noise muted in the distance. Evelyn wasted no time, pulling a folder from her bag and handing it to Clara. "These are internal documents from Whitman Enterprises," Evelyn said. "Emails, financial records, and meeting transcripts. They show how Andrew funneled money through shell companies to fund his acquisitions." Clara opened the folder, her heart racing as she scanned the contents. It was damning evidence, far more incriminating than anything she had uncovered so far. "Why are you giving me this?" Clara asked, her voice quiet but firm. Evelyn's expression hardened. "Because I worked for Andrew for years. I saw how he built his empire, how he destroyed lives without a second thought. I can't undo the damage, but I can help expose the truth." Clara nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Thank you. This could change everything." Evelyn glanced around, her voice lowering. "Be careful, Clara. Andrew's not just ruthless, he's dangerous. He won't go down without a fight." Back in his penthouse, Andrew poured himself a glass of scotch, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. He stared out the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Clara Hart had ignited a firestorm, one that threatened to consume everything he had built. But Andrew wasn't a man who gave in to fear. If Clara wanted a fight, he would give her one. And this time, he wouldn't hold back. The Langston Hall Gala was a cornerstone of the city's social calendar, a dazzling spectacle where fortunes were flaunted, alliances forged, and power quietly redistributed among the elite. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom, chandeliers cast a golden glow over a sea of sharply tailored suits and glittering gowns. Laughter and polite conversation rippled through the room, but beneath the polished surface, every glance and gesture was a calculated move in the city's endless game of influence. Clara Hart stepped through the towering glass doors, a determined calm masking her nerves. The air inside was thick with wealth and privilege, a world far removed from the modest apartment she had left an hour earlier. Her sleek black dress was simple but elegant, chosen to blend in without drawing undue attention. A press pass hung discreetly from her bag, though tonight she wasn't here as a journalist. Tonight, she was hunting for answers. Across the room, Andrew Whitman stood near the bar, a glass of champagne in hand. His tuxedo was immaculate, his posture commanding, but there was a flicker of tension in his eyes as he scanned the crowd. The fallout from Clara's article had shaken his empire more than he cared to admit. Investors were restless, the media relentless, and his carefully curated image was beginning to fray at the edges. He hated it, hated her, but tonight was about damage control. Clara spotted him almost immediately. Andrew's presence was magnetic, even in a room full of powerful figures. But it wasn't admiration she felt as she watched him, it was resolve. The man who had dismissed her so casually during their interview was now the center of a storm she had unleashed, and he didn't even know how much worse it was about to get. She moved carefully through the crowd, listening, observing. Conversations drifted past her, snippets of speculation about Whitman Enterprises, murmurs of unease among those tied to his success. Clara had spent weeks researching the web of connections that bound Andrew to this glittering world, and tonight, she intended to pull a few threads loose. Andrew, meanwhile, was fending off questions from a cluster of business associates, each one carefully worded but loaded with concern. Andrew, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, began, his voice smooth but probing, about this article. "Do you have any idea how the journalist got such detailed information?" Andrew's jaw tightened, though his expression remained neutral. "Baseless accusations," he said dismissively. "She's a hack looking for a headline. My team is handling it." The man nodded, though his skepticism was clear. "Still, it's causing ripples. Some of the younger investors are uneasy." Andrew's smile was thin. "Then they're welcome to take their business elsewhere. Whitman Enterprises isn't built on faint hearts." The group chuckled nervously, but the unease lingered. Andrew excused himself, his patience for the charade wearing thin. As he turned, his eyes swept the room and landed on a figure he hadn't expected to see. Clara. For a moment, he froze, the glass in his hand forgotten. She was standing near the edge of the room, her back to him as she scanned the crowd. Andrew's mind raced. What was she doing here? Who had invited her? And, more importantly, what was she planning? Clara felt his gaze before she saw him. She turned slowly, meeting Andrew's piercing stare from across the room. For a brief moment, the noise and movement around them seemed to fade, leaving only the charged silence between them. Then Andrew's expression shifted, a calculated smile curving his lips as he began making his way toward her. "Miss Hart," he greeted smoothly, his tone polite but edged. "I didn't realize you were on the guest list." Clara matched his smile, though hers carried none of the warmth. "I didn't realize it was a private event." Andrew chuckled, though his eyes were sharp. "Touché. Still, I have to admit, I'm curious. What brings you here? Another article in the works, perhaps?" Clara tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. "You could say that. Though I find these events more useful for listening than writing." Andrew's smile faltered, just for a moment, but he recovered quickly. "Listening? To what, exactly?" "To the truth," Clara replied, her voice steady. "It has a way of surfacing in places like this, don't you think?" The tension between them crackled like a live wire, each word layered with subtext. Clara's calm defiance only fueled Andrew's irritation, but he refused to let it show. "Well," he said, his tone smooth again, "I hope you enjoy the evening. And remember, listening is one thing. Understanding is another." He turned and walked away before she could respond, his mind churning with unease. Clara's presence wasn't a coincidence. She was up to something, and Andrew didn't like not knowing what it was. Later in the evening, Clara found herself speaking with a man she hadn't planned on meeting. Victor Langston, a prominent investor and one of Andrew's most vocal competitors. Tall and impeccably dressed, Victor exuded a charm that was both disarming and deliberate. He had a reputation for leveraging connections to his advantage, and tonight, he seemed intent on drawing Clara into his orbit. "I read your article," Victor said, his voice smooth as they stood near the bar. "Impressive work. Few people have the guts to go after someone like Andrew Whitman." Clara studied him carefully, wary of his intentions. "Exposing the truth isn't about guts. It's about responsibility." Victor smiled, raising his glass in a mock toast. "A noble sentiment. Though I imagine Andrew sees it differently." Clara didn't flinch. "I'm not concerned with how he sees it." Victor chuckled, but there was a glint in his eye. "Good. Because I think you and I might have some common interests." Clara's brow furrowed. "Such as?" Victor leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Let's just say I've been watching Whitman Enterprises for a while, and I have a feeling your investigation is just the beginning." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't sure if Victor was an ally, an opportunist, or something else entirely. But one thing was clear. The battle against Andrew Whitman was drawing in more players than she had anticipated. As the night wore on, Andrew retreated to a quiet corner of the ballroom, nursing a glass of scotch as he watched the crowd. His gaze lingered on Clara, who was now deep in conversation with Victor Langston. A spark of anger flared in his chest. Whatever they were discussing, it couldn't be good for him. Andrew's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. A message from Lisa. "We found something. Call me when you can." For a moment, he hesitated. Then his resolve hardened. Clara might think she had the upper hand, but Andrew wasn't about to let her win. Not without a fight. The days following the Langston Hall Gala were a maelstrom of activity for both Andrew Whitman and Clara Hart. For Andrew, the cracks in his empire widened with every passing hour. For Clara, the revelations came faster than she anticipated, each one more damning than the last. Andrew sat in the back seat of his chauffeured car, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. The city blurred past the tinted windows, but his focus was on Lisa's voice, sharp and precise, as she briefed him on the latest developments. "It's worse than we thought," Lisa said. "The financial records Clara uncovered were just the beginning. There are whispers of a whistleblower, someone high up who's been feeding her information." Andrew's grip on the phone tightened. "Who?" "We're still trying to confirm," Lisa replied, her voice hesitant. But if it's who we suspect, it's someone from your inner circle. Andrew leaned back, the leather seat creaking softly under the weight of his frustration. I want a name, Lisa. Today. Yes, sir, she said before the line disconnected. Andrew stared out the window, his mind racing. The thought of betrayal within his own ranks was infuriating. He prided himself on control, on loyalty, but now that control was slipping, and Clara Hart was the catalyst for it all. Across the city, Clara sat in her small apartment, her laptop open to an encrypted chat window. Evelyn had sent her another batch of documents, meeting transcripts, internal memos, and a trail of payments that painted a damning picture of Andrew's operations. This is incredible, Clara murmured, her eyes scanning the screen. Mark, seated beside her, leaned over to get a better look. No kidding. These records connect Whitman Enterprises to offshore accounts funneling money into land acquisitions. It's not just unethical, it's illegal. Clara nodded, her heart pounding. This could bring him down. Mark glanced at her, his expression wary. And put a giant target on your back? Clara looked up, meeting his gaze. I've already got one. The difference now is that I have proof. Mark sighed, leaning back in his chair. Just be careful, okay? Whitman's not the kind of guy to go down quietly. Clara gave him a faint smile, though the weight of his words lingered. She knew the risks, had known them from the moment she started this investigation. But she also knew she couldn't stop now, not when the truth was so close. Later that evening, Andrew stood in his penthouse office, the city lights sprawling below him like a galaxy of ambition. He swirled a glass of scotch in his hand, his mind churning with questions and suspicions. The whistleblower Lisa mentioned loomed large in his thoughts. Who could it be? And why now? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lisa entered, a thin folder in hand. We have a lead, she said, placing the folder on his desk. Andrew opened it, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the contents. The name on the page sent a cold jolt through him. William Harris, his longtime financial advisor, and one of his most trusted confidants. This doesn't make sense, Andrew said, his voice tight. William's been with me for over a decade. He knows the stakes. Lisa hesitated. We think he's been working with Clara for months, feeding her information. The timing lines up with the initial leaks. Andrew's fist clenched around the glass. Betrayal from someone like William wasn't just a professional blow. It was personal. Set up a meeting, he said coldly. I want to hear it from him. Clara, meanwhile, was preparing for her next move. The documents from Evelyn painted a picture of systemic corruption, but there was still one piece missing, a direct link to Andrew himself. Without it, the story would lack the impact needed to topple his empire. She sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her phone. Evelyn had been cryptic in her last message, hinting at something bigger but refusing to elaborate. Call me, Clara typed, sending the message before she could second-guess herself. A few minutes later, Evelyn's number lit up her screen. You've got everything you need, Evelyn said as soon as Clara answered. Not everything, Clara replied. I need something that ties Andrew directly to these accounts. Without that, he can deny it all. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet sigh. There's one more document, Evelyn said, but getting it won't be easy. What is it? Clara asked, her voice steady. A private ledger, Evelyn said. It's kept in a secure vault at Whitman Enterprises. If you can get it, you'll have your smoking gun. Clara's pulse quickened. How do I access it? Evelyn hesitated. I can get you the codes, but you'll need to be careful. If Andrew finds out, I know the risks, Clara said, cutting her off. Just tell me what I need to do. The next day, Andrew confronted William in a private room at one of his properties. The air between them was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Why? Andrew demanded, his voice low but edged with fury. After everything I've done for you, why would you betray me? William's expression was calm, almost resigned. Because I couldn't look the other way anymore. What you've built, Andrew, it's a house of cards. And it's hurting too many people. Andrew's jaw tightened. You knew the rules when you signed on. Loyalty is non-negotiable. Loyalty to what? William shot back, his voice rising. To greed? To exploitation? I believed in you once, Andrew. But that was before I saw what you were willing to do to get ahead. Andrew stepped closer, his presence towering. You've made a mistake, William. A big one. William didn't flinch. The only mistake I made was staying silent for so long. That night, Clara received the codes from Evelyn and prepared for her boldest move yet. The plan was risky, but the potential payoff was worth it. With Mark's help, she mapped out a strategy to infiltrate Whitman Enterprises and retrieve the ledger. Are you sure about this? Mark asked as they reviewed the details. Clara nodded, her resolve unwavering. This is the final piece. Once we have it, Andrew won't be able to talk his way out of it. Mark sighed, shaking his head. Just don't get caught, okay? I won't, Clara said, though the weight of her own words settled heavily in her chest. As the city slept, two forces moved closer to collision. Andrew Whitman, determined to root out the betrayal threatening his empire, and Clara Hart, on the brink of exposing the truth that would bring it all crashing down. The offices of Whitman Enterprises, with their sleek glass walls and minimalist decor, projected an air of invulnerability. Every detail of the towering skyscraper reflected Andrew Whitman's vision. Efficient, unyielding, and utterly pristine. But beneath the surface of its polished exterior, cracks were forming. Cracks that Andrew was beginning to notice. Andrew sat in the corner office, a coffee cup forgotten on his desk as he flipped through documents Lisa had provided. The room, usually a sanctuary of control, felt oppressive today. The silence buzzed in his ears, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. A sharp knock on the door broke his concentration. Lisa entered, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. We've received another inquiry from the SEC, she began, her voice steady but laced with concern. They want detailed records of the last 5 acquisitions. Andrew's jaw tightened. Do we have an internal response prepared? We do, Lisa replied, setting a folder on his desk. But it's only a matter of time before they dig deeper. Clara's article has given them a reason to scrutinize everything. Andrew leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Clara Hart, he said, the name leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. She's relentless. Lisa hesitated before speaking again. Sir, there's something else. I've been going through our internal communications, and there's an unusual pattern in the logs. Someone's been accessing files they shouldn't have. Andrew's gaze sharpened. Who? We're still tracing it, Lisa admitted. But I have a suspicion it's tied to the whistleblower. Andrew's silence was heavy, the air in the room thick with unspoken tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. Find them. Clara, meanwhile, was preparing for her most daring move yet. The codes Evelyn had provided were precise, but accessing the vault required more than just numbers. It required timing, nerve, and the ability to blend into the sterile, high-security environment of Whitman Enterprises. That evening, Clara walked through the building's imposing lobby, her heart pounding but her steps measured. She wore a tailored black suit, her press badge hidden beneath her coat. Her cover story, if questioned, was simple. She was meeting with a department head for a feature on the company's charitable initiatives. It was just plausible enough to buy her time. Mark's voice crackled through the earpiece concealed beneath her hair. You're inside. Clara glanced around, her voice calm. I'm in. Any updates? Cameras on the lower levels are on a loop, Mark replied. But the vault's security system is separate. You'll only have a few minutes once you're in. Clara nodded subtly, her gaze steady as she approached the elevator. She pressed the button for the restricted lower floors, her fingers tightening briefly around the strap of her bag. The elevator doors slid closed, and as it descended, Clara forced herself to take slow, even breaths. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for years. If she succeeded, she would have the evidence to bring Andrew Whitman's empire crashing down. If she failed, she refused to entertain the thought. Andrew's phone buzzed with a notification as he reviewed the latest damage control measures. He glanced at the screen, his eyes narrowing. An alert from security. Someone had used a clearance code to access a restricted area. He stood abruptly, dialing Lisa. Get down to the vault, he ordered. Now. Is something wrong? Lisa asked, her voice tense. "Just do it," Andrew snapped, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. Clara's hands moved quickly as she entered the final code, the electronic keypad beeping softly with each press. The vault door hissed as it unlocked, the heavy steel panel sliding open to reveal rows of neatly organized files and hard drives. Mark's voice came through the earpiece. "You're in. You've got 3 minutes before the backup systems kick in." Clara stepped inside, her gaze scanning the labels. She found the section marked Acquisitions and began rifling through the files, her movements precise but hurried. Finally, her fingers closed around a slim folder labeled Confidential, Personal Ledger. Her heart raced as she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. It was all there: dates, amounts, and signatures. A direct link between Andrew Whitman and the offshore accounts funding illegal operations. "Got it," Clara whispered, slipping the folder into her bag. But as she turned to leave, a faint sound reached her ears, the echo of approaching footsteps. Her pulse quickened. "Mark," she hissed, her voice urgent. "I'm not alone." Andrew reached the lower level just as Lisa emerged from the stairwell. Her expression was tight, her phone clutched in her hand. "What's going on?" she asked. Andrew didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the end of the hallway where the vault was located. He quickened his pace, his mind racing. Whoever had dared to breach his inner sanctum was about to learn the consequences of crossing him. When he rounded the corner, the sight of the open vault sent a surge of anger through him. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a figure slipping through the opposite door. Clara moved quickly, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She turned a corner and ducked into a maintenance corridor, her breath shallow as she pressed herself against the wall. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. "Mark," she whispered. "I'm in trouble." "Security's mobilizing," Mark replied. "You need to get out. Now." Clara peered around the corner, her eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. The adrenaline coursing through her veins sharpened her focus, but the sound of footsteps closing in sent a chill down her spine. Andrew pushed open the maintenance door, his expression dark as he scanned the empty corridor. He knew the building's layout like the back of his hand, and he wasn't about to let anyone slip away. "Lisa," he said into his phone, "lock down the exits. No one gets out without my authorization." "Yes, sir," Lisa replied. Andrew's eyes flickered with cold determination. Whoever was behind this breach would regret underestimating him. Clara slipped through a side door that led to the parking garage, her pulse hammering in her ears. The folder in her bag felt heavier with every step, the weight of its contents pressing against her conscience. She knew she was moments away from being caught, but the thought of failure spurred her forward. "Mark," she whispered, "I'm almost out." "I've got a car waiting," Mark said. "Take the south exit." Clara nodded, her legs burning as she broke into a sprint. The garage was dimly lit, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the concrete. She spotted the car, a nondescript sedan with its engine idling, and dove inside. Mark, sitting in the driver's seat, didn't waste a second. The car peeled out of the garage, merging seamlessly into the flow of traffic. As the city blurred around her, Clara exhaled shakily, clutching the folder to her chest. She had done it, but she knew the battle was far from over. The sun rose over the city, casting pale streaks of light across Andrew Whitman's penthouse. The typically pristine space was in disarray. Papers strewn across the coffee table, a half-empty glass of scotch sitting precariously on the edge. Andrew stood by the window, staring out at the skyline with unseeing eyes. His reflection was a shadowed version of himself, the usually impeccable mask of control now cracked and frayed. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a haunting refrain. The breach in his security, the stolen ledger, and the unsettling realization that someone had been bold enough to strike at the very heart of his empire. He clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. "Sir," Lisa's voice cut through the silence. She stood in the doorway, tablet in hand, her expression as tense as his own. "We've confirmed it was Clara Hart." Andrew turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "How did she get in?" "We're still piecing that together," Lisa admitted, shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. "But the ledger is gone. If she publishes what's in it, she won't, Andrew interrupted, his voice cold and final. Not until she understands the cost. Across town, Clara sat at her desk, the folder from Whitman Enterprises spread before her. The damning evidence it contained was both exhilarating and terrifying. Bank transfers, signatures, and coded communications, all tying Andrew Whitman directly to a network of offshore accounts and illicit transactions. "This is it," Clara said quietly, her voice trembling with a mixture of triumph and disbelief. "This is everything." Mark, seated beside her, nodded, though his expression was far from celebratory. "Yeah. And now you've painted a target on your back the size of this city." Clara looked up, meeting his gaze. "It's worth it. People deserve to know the truth." Mark sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Just make sure you don't get buried by it." Clara's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Ms. Hart," Andrew's voice came through, sharp and deliberate. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Clara's grip tightened on the phone. "And I believe you have something that belongs to the people you've exploited." There was a pause on the other end, then a low chuckle. "You're bold. I'll give you that. But you don't understand the game you're playing." "I understand perfectly," Clara shot back. "And I'm not afraid of you." "You should be," Andrew replied, his tone chilling. "Because this isn't just about you anymore. You're dragging others into your crusade, and they'll pay the price for your recklessness." Clara's heart sank, her mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "You'll find out soon enough," Andrew said before ending the call. Clara stared at the phone, her pulse pounding. Andrew's words lingered like a dark cloud, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into her resolve. That afternoon, Andrew sat in his office, his legal team gathered around him. The tension in the room was palpable as they reviewed the potential fallout from Clara's expose. "If this goes public," one of the lawyers began, "the SEC will have grounds to launch a full-scale investigation. We're looking at criminal charges, asset freezes, everything." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure it doesn't go public." "And how do you propose we do that?" another lawyer asked cautiously. Andrew leaned forward, his eyes cold. "We remind Clara Hart what happens when she crosses the line." Meanwhile, Clara met with Evelyn in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. The former Whitman Enterprises employee looked more anxious than usual, her eyes darting to the entrance every few minutes. "You're taking a huge risk," Evelyn said, her voice low. "Andrew doesn't lose gracefully. He'll come after you with everything he has." Clara nodded, her expression resolute. "I've come too far to stop now." Evelyn reached across the table, her hand gripping Clara's. "Just promise me you'll be careful. If he finds out I helped you." "He won't," Clara assured her. "I'll make sure of it." But even as she spoke, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew's reach was longer than she had anticipated. By evening, Andrew's counterstrike was underway. He had pulled strings, called in favors, and leveraged his influence to orchestrate a smear campaign against Clara. Within hours, headlines began to circulate, accusing her of fabricating evidence, engaging in unethical journalism, and even accepting bribes from rival corporations. Clara sat in her apartment, staring at the screen in disbelief as the accusations flooded her inbox and social media. The backlash was swift and ruthless, a calculated attempt to discredit her before she could publish the ledger. "They're trying to bury you," Mark said, pacing the room. "You need to go public now, before they turn this into a circus." Clara shook her head, her mind racing. "If I release it now, they'll say it's a desperate move to save my reputation. I need to find a way to make it undeniable." Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. "You can't win. Walk away while you still can." Clara's hands trembled, but she set the phone down, her resolve hardening. "He wants me to be afraid," she said quietly, "but I won't give him the satisfaction." That night, Andrew hosted a private meeting with key allies, politicians, business magnates, and legal experts who owed him favors. The room buzzed with low conversations as Andrew outlined his plan to weather the storm. "This isn't just about protecting my empire," Andrew said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about sending a message. If Clara Hart thinks she can dismantle what I've built, she's gravely mistaken. One of the attendees, a senator with ties to Whitman Enterprises, nodded. What do you need from us? Support, Andrew replied, publicly and privately. Clara's credibility is already under fire. We need to make sure it stays that way. As the meeting progressed, Andrew felt a sense of control returning. He had faced challenges before, and he had always emerged victorious. This would be no different. But across the city, Clara was preparing her own next move. She sat at her desk, staring at the folder and the draft of her article. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she refused to falter. This isn't just about me, Clara whispered to herself. It's about everyone he's hurt. With a deep breath, she began typing, weaving the evidence from the ledger into her story. Every word felt like a step closer to the truth, a truth Andrew Whitman could no longer hide from. As the clock struck midnight, Clara hit save, her article ready for publication. She leaned back in her chair, her exhaustion giving way to a quiet determination. Tomorrow, the world would know everything. The morning dawned cold and gray, the city wrapped in a mist that dulled the usual buzz of activity. For Clara Hart, the atmosphere mirrored the weight pressing on her chest. She sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open to the draft of the article that would change everything. Her finger hovered over the publish button. The evidence she had gathered, the ledger, the testimonies, and the detailed web of financial misconduct, was damning. Andrew Whitman's empire was built on lies and exploitation, and today, the world would finally see him for what he truly was. Mark's voice broke her concentration. You don't have to do this alone, you know. Clara looked up to find him standing in the doorway, a cup of coffee in hand. His concern was evident, but so was his support. I know, she said softly, but this is my fight. Mark set the cup down on the table. Just remember, once this goes live, there's no turning back. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. With a deep breath, she clicked publish. The screen flashed briefly before displaying the confirmation. Your article has been successfully posted. It's done, Clara said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Mark nodded, his expression a mix of pride and worry. Now we wait. Across town, Andrew Whitman was in his office, oblivious to the storm about to engulf him. He was reviewing the latest updates from his legal team when Lisa burst in, her face pale. Sir, she said, holding up her phone. You need to see this. Andrew took the phone, his eyes narrowing as he read the headline. The final nail. How Andrew Whitman's empire was built on corruption and exploitation. Below it was Clara's byline and a photo of the stolen ledger, its damning contents laid bare. For a moment, Andrew didn't move. The room seemed to close in around him, the weight of the revelation pressing down like a physical force. Get the PR team in here, he said sharply, his voice breaking the silence. Now. Lisa hesitated. Sir, it's already everywhere. The news outlets are picking it up. Social media is exploding. Andrew's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He had faced challenges before, but this felt different. Clara hadn't just attacked his reputation. She had struck at the very foundation of his empire. Within hours, the fallout began. News channels ran segments dissecting Clara's article, experts debating the implications of the evidence she had uncovered. Protesters gathered outside Whitman Enterprises, their chants echoing through the streets. Investors scrambled to distance themselves, and the company's stock plummeted. Andrew watched it all unfold from the confines of his office, his expression unreadable. He was used to being in control, but now, control felt like a distant memory. Lisa entered, her usually composed demeanor fraying at the edges. The board is calling an emergency meeting, she said. They want answers. Andrew turned to her, his eyes cold. I'll handle it. But as he stepped into the boardroom, the hostility was palpable. The executives who had once hung on his every word now looked at him with a mixture of fear and resentment. This is a disaster, one of them said, slamming a folder onto the table. How could you let it come to this? Andrew's voice was calm, but his anger simmered beneath the surface. The situation is under control. Under control? Another executive shot back. Our stock is in free fall. The SEC is launching an investigation. We're on the verge of collapse. Andrew met their gazes, his tone sharp. I built this company. I've faced worse than this, and I've always come out on top. But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his mind. The usual certainty he wielded like a weapon now felt hollow. Clara, meanwhile, was fielding calls from reporters, each one eager to delve deeper into her story. Her phone buzzed constantly, but she ignored most of the notifications, focusing instead on the messages of support flooding her inbox. One email stood out, a short, cryptic note from Evelyn. He knows. Be careful. Clara's stomach tightened. She had expected Andrew to retaliate, but the warning still sent a chill down her spine. She glanced at Mark, who was monitoring social media trends on his laptop. Evelyn thinks he's planning something, Clara said. Mark frowned. He's desperate. That makes him dangerous. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. Let him try. The truth is out now. There's nothing he can do to stop it. As night fell, Andrew sat alone in his penthouse, a glass of scotch untouched on the table before him. The events of the day replayed in his mind. The article, the protests, the accusations. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He picked up his phone and stared at the screen for a long moment before dialing a number. Clara answered on the second ring. Andrew, she said, her voice steady. I was wondering when you'd call. Andrew exhaled slowly. You've done your damage, Clara. What more do you want? I want accountability, Clara replied. I want justice for everyone you've hurt. Andrew leaned back, his gaze distant. And what happens when the dust settles? Do you think you've won? This isn't about winning, Clara said. It's about the truth. There was a long silence before Andrew spoke again. You don't know everything. Clara's brow furrowed. What does that mean? It means, Andrew said, his voice low, you might not like what you find when you keep digging. The line went dead, leaving Clara staring at her phone, her mind racing. Andrew's words felt like a warning, but they also hinted at something deeper, something she hadn't uncovered yet. The next morning, Clara's article dominated the headlines. The SEC announced a formal investigation into Whitman Enterprises, and calls for Andrew's resignation grew louder. But amidst the chaos, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew's parting words were more than just a threat. As she walked through the city, the chants of protesters echoed in her ears. She had exposed the truth, but the battle wasn't over. There were still shadows lurking behind the curtain, and Clara knew she had to be ready for whatever came next. The office of Whitman Enterprises, once a bustling hive of ambition and efficiency, now felt like a tomb. The usually pristine hallways were quiet, their polished surfaces reflecting the dim glow of emergency lights. Staff moved cautiously, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb the fragile air of uncertainty that had settled over the company. In his private office, Andrew Whitman stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The skyline, once a testament to his achievements, now seemed to mock him. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, tired, disheveled, and, for the first time in years, uncertain. Behind him, Lisa entered, a tablet clutched tightly in her hands. The board voted, she said, her voice breaking the silence. It's unanimous. They want your resignation. Andrew didn't turn. He had expected this. And the SEC? They've officially launched their investigation, Lisa replied. Subpoenas are going out to key executives. The press is already speculating about criminal charges. Andrew's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. For years, he had navigated crises with precision, always finding a way to come out on top. But this time, the walls were closing in, and there was no escape. Across town, Clara sat in her apartment, her laptop open to a flurry of emails and notifications. The fallout from her article had been swift and overwhelming. Public support poured in, along with messages from whistleblowers who had been waiting for someone to take down Andrew Whitman. But there were also threats, anonymous emails warning her to stop digging, social media posts accusing her of ulterior motives, and one particularly chilling voicemail that left her feeling cold. This is what you signed up for, she muttered to herself, though the weight of it all was beginning to press down on her. Mark, seated on the couch nearby, glanced up from his own screen. "You look like you haven't slept in days," he said, his tone half concerned, half teasing. Clara managed a faint smile. "That's because I haven't." Mark stood, stretching before walking over to her. "You need to take a break, Clara. This fight isn't over, but you're no good to anyone if you burn out." Clara sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I know. It's just, there's so much at stake. If I let up now, Andrew could spin this in his favor." Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've already done more than anyone else has. Let the system work for a change." Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She had seen how systems failed the vulnerable before, and she wasn't ready to trust them just yet. The next day, Andrew faced the press for what he knew would be the most humiliating moment of his career. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the podium, his tailored suit doing little to disguise the tension in his frame. The gathered reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. "Ladies and gentlemen," Andrew began, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I am here to announce that, effective immediately, I will be stepping down as CEO of Whitman Enterprises." The room erupted, the press scrambling to capture his next words. Andrew held up a hand, silencing them. "This decision was not made lightly," he continued. "But in light of recent allegations and the ongoing investigation, I believe it is in the best interest of the company and its stakeholders that I step aside." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I will cooperate fully with the investigation and remain committed to ensuring that Whitman Enterprises continues to serve its clients and the community with integrity." As he stepped away from the podium, the reporters' questions followed him like a swarm. But Andrew didn't look back. He had delivered his statement, and that was all they would get from him. Clara watched the press conference from her apartment, her expression unreadable. Mark sat beside her, his arms crossed as he studied Andrew's carefully crafted apology. "Well, he didn't exactly admit to anything," Mark said, his tone dry. "But I guess that's the closest we'll get to an apology." Clara shook her head. "This isn't over. He's stepping down, but that doesn't mean he's giving up. Men like Andrew Whitman don't just fade into the background." Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So what's next? Are you going to keep digging?" Clara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the screen. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've exposed the truth, but there's still so much we don't understand. Why did he do it? How did he justify it to himself?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "Do you think you'll ever get those answers?" Clara shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. But I have to try." Later that evening, Andrew sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. His resignation had been met with mixed reactions. Some praised him for taking responsibility, while others saw it as an admission of guilt. But for Andrew, it didn't matter. His empire was crumbling, and he had no one to blame but himself. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. An email from his lawyer. "Meeting scheduled with the SEC for next week. Prepare accordingly." Andrew closed his eyes, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He thought of Clara, her sharp eyes and unwavering determination. She had been a thorn in his side, but now he couldn't help but admire her resolve. For the first time in years, Andrew felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: regret. Not just for the empire he had built, but for the people he had hurt along the way. Clara walked through the city that night, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She had accomplished what she set out to do, but the victory felt hollow. The scars left by Andrew's actions wouldn't fade overnight, and the battle for justice was far from over. As she passed a newsstand, her eyes caught the headline, "Whitman Empire Topples. A New Era for Accountability?" Below it was a photo of Andrew, his expression grim as he left the press conference. Clara stopped, staring at the image. For a moment, she felt a flicker of empathy, a recognition that, despite his wealth and power, Andrew was just as human as anyone else. But empathy didn't excuse his actions, and as Clara walked away, she knew one thing for certain. The truth mattered, and she would continue to fight for it, no matter the cost. The city moved on, as cities always do. Headlines that had once been dominated by Clara Hart's expose of Andrew Whitman's empire gradually gave way to new stories. political scandals, celebrity gossip, and the everyday churn of the news cycle. But for those directly impacted by the fallout, the reverberations were far from over. Clara Hart sat in the same cafe where she had first met Evelyn, her notebook open in front of her. The pages were filled with hastily scrawled notes, a mixture of observations, interview questions, and loose thoughts. She was preparing for another story, not as explosive as her last, but no less important. This time, it was about the families displaced by Whitman Enterprises, their lives uprooted by the greed that had fueled his empire. The waitress approached, setting a fresh cup of coffee on the table. Clara offered a small smile of thanks before returning to her notes. She was tired, but a different kind of tired. One born not of defeat, but of persistence. For the first time in years, she felt like she was making a tangible difference. Her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was an email from an unknown sender, the subject line simple, "You need to see this." Clara hesitated for a moment before opening it. The email contained a single attachment, a video file. Her heart raced as she clicked on it, the screen filling with grainy footage. It was a recording of a private meeting at Whitman Enterprises, the timestamp placing it several months before her article was published. Andrew Whitman's voice came through the speakers, calm and measured. "This isn't about greed," he said. "It's about survival. If we don't make these acquisitions, someone else will. And they won't think twice about who they hurt in the process." Clara leaned closer, her pulse quickening. The video was a glimpse into Andrew's mindset, a rationalization of the harm he had caused. But it was the final line that struck her the hardest. "Sometimes," Andrew continued, his tone almost regretful, "you have to be the villain to stay in the game." The video ended, leaving Clara staring at her screen. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger at his unapologetic arrogance, but also a strange sense of understanding. Andrew wasn't just a man who reveled in power. He was a man who had convinced himself it was necessary. Meanwhile, Andrew sat in the office of his lawyer, the weight of the past weeks etched into his features. The investigation by the SEC was moving quickly, and his once unshakable confidence had eroded under the constant scrutiny. "You'll need to consider a plea deal," his lawyer said, his tone matter-of-fact. "The evidence is overwhelming. If you cooperate, we might be able to reduce the charges." Andrew stared at the papers in front of him, his signature required on nearly every page. For a man who had built his life on control, the act of signing away his autonomy felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. "What happens after this?" Andrew asked, his voice quiet. The lawyer hesitated before replying. "You rebuild. Slowly. And differently." Andrew nodded, though the words felt hollow. Rebuilding wasn't just about his career. It was about his identity, the man he had become, and the man he would need to become if he hoped to move forward. Weeks later, Clara attended a community meeting in a small, crowded hall. The families displaced by Andrew's developments had gathered to discuss their next steps, many of them still grappling with the fallout of losing their homes and livelihoods. As Clara listened, she felt a pang of guilt. Exposing Andrew had been a victory, but it hadn't solved the problems his actions had created. These people were still struggling, still waiting for justice. One of the speakers, an older man with weathered hands, stood and addressed the group. "We've been through hell," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "But we're still here. And as long as we're here, we keep fighting." The room erupted into applause, and Clara felt a spark of hope. These were the people Andrew had underestimated, the ones who had refused to be broken by his ambition. And now, they were finding their strength. Andrew, now living in relative obscurity, watched the news from a modest apartment far removed from his penthouse. The camera panned over a protest outside one of his former properties, the chants of the crowd faint but clear. He set down the remote and stared at the blank screen. For years, he had been at the center of everything, admired, envied, feared. Now, he was on the sidelines, watching as the world moved on without him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find a delivery man holding an envelope. Andrew signed for it and closed the door, his brow furrowing as he examined the sender. Clara Hart. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was brief, but its contents left him stunned. "Dear Andrew, you once told me I didn't understand the game. Maybe you were right, but the game isn't what matters. What matters is the people we hurt when we play it. I don't know if you'll ever truly understand the damage you've done, but if you're capable of change, maybe you can start by helping the people you left behind. They're stronger than you think. They've had to be. The choice is yours." Clara Hart. Andrew read the letter twice, his chest tightening. Clara's words were a challenge, but they were also an opportunity, a chance to do something he had rarely considered, to make amends. For the first time in years, Andrew felt the faint stirrings of something unfamiliar. It wasn't guilt or regret. It was hope. As Clara walked home that evening, she felt the weight of the journey she had undertaken. She had exposed the truth, but the work was far from over. Still, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The city lights sparkled in the distance, a reminder that even in darkness, there was light. The fight for justice was never truly over, but Clara knew she wasn't alone in it. And as she stepped into the night, she felt a quiet resolve that carried her forward. The world wasn't perfect, but it could be better, and that was enough.